Okay, so tell me how you ended up going to Edinburgh and what happened there and when it was exactly, etc.
My girlfriend Susie Rhinesmith and I, and another friend, Jenny Laisel, dreamed up the idea that we would like to study away from Allegheny College, but overseas someplace. Sue and I applied to Paris and got in, and then we panicked at the thought of writing essays in French, even though we were both taking French and doing just absolutely fine. Two friends did go to Paris. Jenny Laisel had no interest in Paris, but she did in St. Andrews because she could wear a nice long cape. Sue and I hardly hesitated then to go to Edinburgh. Just a fantastic experience all year long, which whenever my students would ask me, or my friends would ask me where I considered my true home and what set me on my intellectual and personal quest, I always said Edinburgh. Now, why? Oh, they said you met your husband there. And indeed, I did meet Kenneth Vaux, your father, at the Lord Provost Magistrate and Council Ball for the city of Edinburgh on Tuesday, the 28th of November, 1961, at a reception for overseas students, of whom we were 1/4 of the student population. Fantastic affair on George Street. Your dad and I went looking for it after 40 years, and it's now kind of a beer hall. It's tawdry, almost unfindable. It hasn't been painted for years, and is a good candidate for 37-foot council housing or such. But it was quite gorgeous then, absolutely. So that's where I met your father, but that wasn't the most fantastic part of the year, because I think I really came alive as a scholar, which is what I really wanted always to do with my life. From the time I was a quiet little girl buried with piles of books, or the day I went to Allegheny College and spent the first 2 days of orientation in their beautiful little library, not the real library, but a reception hall, just reading around the shelves. So here I was in Edinburgh, where my mates who were studying British history, art history, and English with me, and Susie studied moral philosophy instead of British history. But everybody I met had a fantastic school's preparation with their A-levels and were primed to go. In a lot of cases, they said they didn't even need to go to the lectures for the classes. They knew it all already. But mostly, they were already interested in books and ideas and learning and history and beauty and the philosophy of beauty and politics. It's where I discovered how political I really was at heart, by breaking away from Susie and some of my more, friends who like to do other things and go to dark little cafes and talk mostly about Britain and France during the war and after the war. Communism, socialism, the failure of capitalism, whatever, the ruins of Britain after the war. That was really of interest because although I came from an industrial town in northern Indiana, South Bend, the 17 years that I had lived there, it was prosperous. The buildings were not that old. They'd recovered from the Depression. The schools were really strong. At least my school had Latin, German, and French to advanced degrees. And teachers who, like my dad, had either a PhD or higher masters and were quite talented. Now, South Bend, the town I was coming from, was fairly prosperous. I went to Edinburgh, and it looked to me, and when I think back about it, it's like the war ended last week. Food was cheap, that was good. The streets were not repaired. The houses were crumbling. The main buildings had not yet been cleaned. They look quite gorgeous in the sun now, but they were black with smoke and pollution. The air was fairly dirty. And only on Princess Street on a sunny Sunday, when Sue and I walked to the Unitarian church we joined, did you see what Edinburgh could be and had been and would be again. Banks of flowers stretched out for a mile. The little hillsides, the backside of the High Street, with the traces of 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, without the feeling that the foundations were crumbling. So I loved Edinburgh from the very first day we were there. I should say the week before we went to Edinburgh, we landed in London. Susie's trunk went, we don't know where. We each had a big trunk for the year. So we spent most of the week trying to track down where it might have been sent, and we finally found it. But we also spent every night wandering the streets, going to plays, eating in pubs, fish and chips and smashed green peas. Drinking a little beer. We were great drinkers. Just trying to talk to people on the street, most of whom shunned us. So we were too shiny, and we couldn't shed our American accents. We were quite good at shedding the accents by the time we got to Edinburgh, but never mind. One night, however, we were down in Piccadilly, and we walked right into a race riot. There were Packies, as the Brits were saying, who, together with the police, were beating a group of Pakistani, I assume, young men who I suppose had just gone down to go to a play too. But it was quite frightening. Seeing Charlottesville pictures recently with the Nazis beating everybody, it very much reminded me of that. And later, Chicago in the 60s, where you had all the hatred coming out over Martin Luther King Jr., and of course what your father experienced in Mississippi, and then up in Pittsburgh in his big church. I had to think of what adjective I would put in there. It's not. Probably we'll just censor that. I was somewhat prepared. I always hearken back to that night when Sue and I were cowering in a doorway, but we were still trying to take everything in case we were needed to give evidence. But it got so unruly that we slipped through a back passageway and got out to the next street and found a bus. But it was pretty awful.
What was the date of that?
That would have been the first week we hit town. I think we hit town on Susie's birthday, which was October 1st of 1961. So maybe the next day. So, we had been prepared to go to Europe by another Allegheny friend who had spent the year in Edinburgh. We had our pages of notes. What wasn't included was how careful we had to be as young women as to where we went, whom we met, to whom we spoke, what we ate, etc. Nothing prepared us for Italy, I should say. But that was in a separate category. But we did try to hew to safety rules, but also to customs, and listen carefully. I had a little booklet, I don't know where it is, where Sue and I wrote down the British isms that we heard that were so fascinating. Okay, so then we took the Flying Scotsman after a week, went to London, went to Edinburgh. And what was that like? I would say we took a taxi, except we decided we were going to save money that year, which we both did. We wanted to travel. But I don't think we walked all the way to Pilrick Street where we had rented a room. We probably took the bus up Leith Walk. Okay, so we got to, by the way, I could talk all day. I just about that year. It was so eventful. For one reason, I was out of Indiana. I was away from South Bend. Even better, I was away from Clarion, Pennsylvania, where although we later came to buy a cabin in the woods near Dad's relatives, and 15 miles away from Clarion, I said I'd never go back there. I was getting out. I went to Allegheny and then went to Edinburgh. We wanted to escape, but more, we just wanted a wider world, helped immeasurably by A, studying British history, B, the English literature, which in our sensational lectures, by an endless parade of learned, of course, gentlemen. I don't think we had a woman lecturer all year. Always, every piece of work, Chaucer, no matter who, was set in a broader context of the times. So I'd leave the lecture and we'd go to the reading room and we just read up on every bit. We took extensive notes, which unfortunately I didn't keep, on everything that was mentioned in the lecture so we could do background reading. Very helpful, very helpful. Okay, so that was...
living in Leith, you said?
Yeah, we were living down Leith Walk on Pilrig Street, 90 Pilrig Street. A few years ago when Dan and I went for our 40th anniversary, as I mentioned earlier, with George Street and the Ball where we had met, that particular tall Georgian building is now a brothel. I think there's a line of brothels there. We stayed down the way, and Pilrig was considerably seedier even than in its post-war period I mentioned before, where the buildings were gray and were collapsing. The brothel looked lovely on the inside. I rang the doorbell, and they greeted me very eagerly, it seemed. And I looked in, the big, beautiful hallway. They had smashed out a wall to the next building, the next house, so it was this broad parlor lit with fluffy fringed red lighting, and there were lots of good-looking women and men running around, clothed rather gaudily. Who knows what kind of a brothel it was. They were very friendly, and I said, "Oh, I used to live here. I lived on the not the top floor. I lived up on the 4th floor in a room with huge. Would you like to see it?" I said, "No, thank you. My husband's waiting for me." So I went back. That moment was the more ironic or delightful, probably delightful to me, to see what had happened to the building. A, it was intact, which was lovely. But B, to be a brothel, when that's where Mr. Ewart and his wife, or his sister Ava and her husband and boy live. They were members of the Free Methodist Church of Edinburgh that had a baptismal font. It's a tall, skinny building. Sue and I and the other members of our household, of whom there were 11, were taken to see a baptism, taken by our landlord to see a baptism. I can only say that the people, the evangelical groups who are causing havoc in America now, came right out of that atmosphere all over Europe and plopped down on American shores, and in many cases set out on an agenda of intolerance. That was the kind of atmosphere we felt in that church for the 4 hours we were there, watching screaming and yelling and dunking people to the point of drowning, waterboarding, one might say, and living a year with a man who was a fanatical Christian, who were furious with Sue and me because we went to a Unitarian church, and at one point in the year called us into the common room, Mr. Ewart and his sister, to excoriate us for being dirty little American Jews. And you may say, That's very strange. But we had made a damp spot on the threadbare carpet drying our clothes. That was one thing, but mostly we didn't put shillings in the little electric heater since we were saving money. And Eva, the sister, got a lot of kickback from those shillings, so they were furious. Those were the two things. And then just being gaudy and going to the Universal Unitarian Church. That was so Susie was dissolved in sobs. And I said, A, it's unchristian to throw us out on the street. We have no money and no place to sleep. And B, throw me out, but don't throw out Susie. She hasn't done anything, which I felt very strongly. She was sweet and smart and trusting and had no battle with anyone. And we decided equally not to put shillings in. Okay, so we were tight, but that's the way we chose to behave. We wore our bathrobes and piles of covers and earmuffs and studied at night. I went to the reading rooms, which had big hot water pipes running through them. You could put your feet on those. So mostly I was, having brought up a Methodist and going to Epworth Forest Church Camp, I was much more practiced than she at flipping guilt and shame around. So I guilted them. I did. I still remember that, and I'm very happy I did. And they kind of thought twice about it, and it's okay, you can stay, but put shillings in the meter, which we still didn't do. Anyway, that sticks with me because I hear echoes of those sermons that Jack, the landlord, gave us every Sunday night. And then he brought in his single young men for Bible study. Who were very, very nice boys, but I don't think they knew what they were getting into. Mr. Ewart was quite a predatory fellow. Okay, I'm not very far yet, am I? Although the eviction incident took place. Yeah, it took place before we went away for Easter break. So, and I know that because on Easter break, the 5 weeks Sue and I traveled with your father in 2 bad cars. Your dad will be glad to give you details on that if you don't already know them. Your dad had become attached to me and called for me at the door. This is like 2 months after the eviction incident. And Mr. Ewart later told me I could see in his eyes he'd been saved. So Sue and I got the royal treatment after that. So anyway. Well, anyway.
Make a break there.